Yeah, it means probably that we should be starting. It's 6 o'clock sharp. My name is Magda Harzyńska-Wójcik, and somewhere on the screen is also Professor Monika Opalińska. We are responsible for the series, and we will play hosts during today's meeting. Monika works at the Warsaw University in Poland and is a founding member of Siglum, a research group for the study of manuscripts. And I'm affiliated with the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana and the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin in Poland. The idea for this seminar series first emerged last March under the circumstances which I think deserve to be briefly recounted here because they played a part in our decision to launch the meetings. As I said, it was last March, and we had been 2 years into the pandemic, which had cut us off real-life encounters, but taught us to use communication platforms as meeting substitutes. So, starved of human contact, we were at the same time equipped with technology, which, though imperfect as far as human interaction is concerned, had this added value of overcoming distances. And online meetings made their way into our agendas. So last year at more or less this time, we were in for a special treat. Jane Margaret Toswell agreed to talk on Zoom on Old English Psalms at the invitation of Monika Opalińska. The talk was scheduled for the 8th of March. But before that happened, came February the 24th, full-scale Russian invasion on Ukraine. The world was shocked. There was nothing else we could think of but the fate of Ukrainians, our friends, our neighbors, suffering people. We were scared for them, for us, and for the future of Europe. Under these circumstances, the question naturally arose for the lecture organizers if they should go on with the plan, or should the talk be postponed. As it turned out, everybody wanted the lecture to take place. Not because we didn't care, but precisely because we cared so much. And the lecture on the Psalms was what we all needed. The lecture was magnificent, as you can imagine. And when it was over, we obviously talked about the Psalms, but also about how we realized the importance of this meeting under these circumstances. How much it mattered to meet and to discuss what we feel passionate about. It was important for all of us. Not as if nothing had happened. Not as if we wanted to forget about the atrocities facing Ukraine. No. It was an important continuity in the face of hostile reality. We were shattered, but not crushed. The lecture gathered us together and it saved us by the saving power of passion. In our case, the saving power of our common passion for the Psalms and Psalters. So this is how the series came to be. Out of passion, circumstances, and an epiphany how it matters to all of us to be able to do what we love. The series relies on what is probably the only benefit of the pandemic. The popularization of the digital meeting format, which offers instantaneous elimination of distance. And it was inspired by what we realized during Jane Toswell's lecture, as simple as it sounds. We want to meet and talk about the Psalms and Psalters. Outside the usual conference rush, where there are never enough talks about the Psalms, and there is never enough time to present what we want to say. I think that's a common experience. We usually frantically stage our talks to make it into 20 minutes at the expense of all delightful details, which turn our research into an adventure and work into pleasure. So this is, in a nutshell, why we're going to meet and talk every fourth Thursday throughout the academic year and after the holidays. And I'm delighted to announce that the list of speakers started to grow already into the next year. Before moving on to Professor Michael Kuczynski's lecture, let me express our thanks to all speakers for accepting the invitation to the series, because without that, the series would not have come to be. Also, We owe a great debt of gratitude to the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame, for the team, for helping us with all the technicalities. It is thanks to them, thanks to you, that we maneuvered safely through the digital intricacies, what we know next to nothing about. Hic sunt dracones. A person who has helped us with the dragons enormously also is Agnieszka Fabiańska, head of the manuscript department at the University of Warsaw Library. Thank you. And thank you all for being here, for joining the series, and for sharing the passion. Last but not least, I cannot forget to thank Jane Toswell for that lecture last March. Thank you, Jane. Finally, let me introduce our inaugural speaker, Professor Michael Kuczynski. Well, there are those of us who derive prestige in the academic world through the university we are affiliated with. And rightly so, because our universities speak of our ambitions and capacities. But there are also scholars who, no matter how prestigious their university is, will always add to its prestige by the university's association with them. And Professor Michael Kuczynski represents that second case. He was educated at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, at the University of North Carolina, where he also got his PhD and where he worked for some time, among other places. He is currently professor of English at the Tulane University in New Orleans. His research focus is the reception of the Psalms during the Middle Ages and the translation of the first English Bible, especially its Old Testament glosses. Apart from that, he has also published on areas as diverse as Chaucer, medieval mysticism, the relationship between poetry and the visual arts during the Middle Ages, medieval astronomy, 18th century antiquarianism, and 19th century medievalism. He not only studies medieval manuscripts and incunables, but also examines the application of information gleaned from them to textual, literary, and cultural analyses. Importantly, he generously shares his passion outside the academic environment by introducing Middle English texts, manuscripts, and early printed books to secondary school students and adults in the workforce in the greater New Orleans area. He has published monographs on the Psalms, which we know him from: Prophetic Song, the Psalms as Moral Discourse in Late Medieval England, and a glossed Wycliffe's Psalter, Bodleian Library, Oxford Manuscript Bodley 554. As I've learned, he's currently working on 3 more monographs and a descriptive catalogue, all of them very medieval. Professor Kuczynski has authored over 30 scholarly articles, book chapters, as well as several publications intended for the general public, and over 40 book reviews. He has given a staggering number of invited lectures and conference presentations all over the world. Professor Kuczynski has launched several brilliant initiatives, organized or co-organized numerous symposia, and was crucially involved in so many other academic enterprises in such great numbers that it is impossible to do all of these efforts justice in a brief presentation. It is therefore best to give the floor over to Professor Michael Kuczynski, who is going to deliver a talk entitled Rescuing Rolle. Henry Ramsden Bramley edits the English Psalter. Mike, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Magda. It'll take me 1 minute here there we go. Can everyone see that PowerPoint? All right, great. Magda, thank you so much for that very moving introduction to the series. My wife, Christina, and I have a good friend and colleague who is a medievalist in Ukraine. Right now, we're in daily contact with her. And she recently wrote to my wife, Christina, to say, just how much her own devotion to her work, to her students, to her colleagues is helping her to deal with, the terrible devastation that surrounds that surrounds her and her family. So thank you. Thank you for those words. And thank you so much for those very kind and embarrassing words about me. And thanks to everyone, including the University of Notre Dame, the University of Warsaw, King Elise, with whom I first made contact with Magda. I think she's on this call. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here this morning, even on Zoom, to talk with so many people who love to study the Psalms. One reason that readers and scholars gravitate toward the Psalms, I think, is their raw emotional power, their verbal directness. Although ancient, they can sound uncannily modern. The image on my title slide is from the mid-13th century Caro Psalter, so named because of its use by the nuns of Caro near Norwich. The manuscript is now in the collection of the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, Maryland. It depicts in the upper and lower halves of a large capital S 2 episodes from the well-known story of the prophet Jonah. His attempted drowning by some sailors who discover him to be a threat to their ship because he's on the run from God, and his salvation from the mouth of a whale by the same God whom he is trying to elude. The image begins Psalm 68 in the Vulgate numbering. Salvum me fac Deus. Save me, O God. And now I'm going to paraphrase. Because waves crash against my spirit. I'm stuck in the mud and I'm slipping. I'm out of my depth. A storm approaches. My throat burns from sobbing. My eyes are blind with tears. I still hope in you. What could be more modern than words and sentiments such as these? Their theism aside, the mixture of agitation and resolve reminds me of a passage from the writings of Samuel Beckett. Where am I? I don't know. I'll never know. In the silence, you don't. You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. And yet, the directness of the Psalms, our intuitive identification with their words, is illusory. As a medievalist, I'm constantly made aware of how all our meetings with the Psalms and Psalters are mediated. We have no choice but to struggle to understand these poems through thick layers of editing, translation, and interpretation, ancient, medieval, and modern. St. Jerome translated the Psalms 3 times from Greek and Hebrew into Latin and remained dissatisfied with his work. The Wycliffites, who produced 2 Middle English versions of the Psalter at the end of the 14th century, based on Jerome's second translation, the Gallicanum, complained bitterly about the discord between their texts and the Hebrew originals. Always, there is something lost in the process of translation and interpretation. In fact, each translation of the Psalms is itself an interpretation of these profoundly moving poems, more or less congruent, depending on who is doing the translating, with the intentions of their authors. My 17 years of research on an edition of the glossed Wycliffite Psalter, published with Oxford University Press in 2019, made me acutely aware of the mediated nature of our knowledge of the Psalms. To get a handle on their literal meaning, the Wycliffites turned to Nicholas of Lyra, a 14th century Franciscan interpreter devoted to what he called the Hebrew truth of the Psalter. In his commentary, Nicholas puts the scholar's dilemma in perspective. Not even the number of psalms and divisions of the Psalter are universally agreed upon. Nicholas bemoans, for example, persistent attempts by ignorant editors to elide Psalms 31 and 32, since the latter, exultate justi in Domino, has no authoritative titulus or superinscription to distinguish it from its predecessor. Underlying Nicholas's argument about the two Psalms in his commentary is a frustration at ongoing disagreement about the shape of the Psalter itself and its implications for exegesis. Nicholas observes that Jerome never mentions these two Psalms as conjoined. So it should be clear to sensible people that they are as distinct in the Hebrew as they are in the Latin, and vice versa. At least they have been interpreted as such by the intelligent from Jerome's day to our own. And that, Nicholas says, is a very long time, since Jerome flourished when Gratian and Valentinian ruled around the year 381. And I'm writing my commentary in 1326. If the number and integrity of particular psalms are still in dispute after almost a millennium, what hope can there be of establishing a sound text and explaining its meaning? During the Middle Ages, the Psalms were at the center of the church's liturgical life and were regarded as a digest of the wisdom of Scripture. Still, a great many of their secrets remain hidden and require, as I've said, constant mediation. This mediation, as in Nicholas's commentary, often takes the form of a rescue mission, saving the Psalms from their uninformed and inept students. Today, I'm going to be speaking about a highly influential vernacular version of the Psalter, written in mid-14th century England by a Yorkshire contemplative named Richard Rolle, and about an edition of this text made at the end of the 19th century by an English clergyman, Henry Ramsden Bramley. Altogether, Rolle's English Psalter, as I'll be calling it, and Bramley's edition of it have mediated the sense of the Psalms for Middle English scholars for nearly 700 years. 25 manuscripts of Rolle's original work survive. Only 4 of these extracts or fragments in all the Middle English dialects. The text was very widely copied and read. Notwithstanding Anne Hudson's brilliant 3-volume edition of 2 versions of Rolle's text, as it was revised during the 15th century by the Wycliffites, no modern critical edition of Rolle's original version has appeared. In other words, except for those willing and able to examine all the manuscripts directly, scholars who write on the English Psalter have to access it through Bramley, whose edition, for all its limitations, has yet to be superseded. What I have to say this morning will be more about the 19th than the 14th century. I've become interested in the psychology, as it were, of Bramley's edition. What spurred him to work on it for, as I estimate, at least 10 years? And how did he decide to manage the complex codicological situation he faced in producing it? Bramley's biography has been very little investigated. despite the considerable and ongoing influence of his Rolle edition. My ongoing archival research into his life and career, some of which I'll share with you today, has convinced me that he was, in many respects, the ideal editor for Rolle's text, and also that he may have understood his editorial work as an effort to rescue Rolle as a person and as a Psalms exegete from obscurity and misunderstanding. Most of what is known about Richard Rolle derives from his voluminous Latin and Middle English writings and the efforts of his disciples to promote his canonization, an enterprise that failed. Rolle, for instance, wrote a revealing spiritual autobiography entitled Incendium Amoris, The Fire of Love. His followers, after his death, turned the location of his final hermitage, the village of Hampole in the West Riding, into a pilgrimage site and drew up an office or spiritual resume of his life and miracles. Rolle was born sometime around 1300 and died, possibly of the plague, in 1349. As Bramley argues in his edition, evidence internal to the English Psalter, references to the disastrous reign of Edward II, suggests that he completed his text between 1326 and 1327. The text itself is threefold in character: a verse-by-verse Latin Psalter interwoven with a scrupulous verse-by-verse Middle English translation and commentary, derived primarily, but not exclusively, from a 12th century Psalms catena, or anthology of authorities, by the scholastic writer Peter Lombard. As Magda has shown in her work, the Latin text of the Psalms, as given by Rolle, is that of Jerome's second version, the Gallicanum, the basis for the Vulgate and the same base used for the Wycliffite Bible. The English Psalter contains a few Latin readings, however, derived from other versions of the Psalms. Rolle could have encountered some of these in his copy of the Lombard, who reproduces and sometimes adjudicates them in passages that cite Augustine's Enarrationes in Psalmos. Rolle also produced, during his lifetime, a Latin verse-by-verse commentary on the Psalms. This text is largely independent of his English Psalter, however, and does not figure in my discussion today. Rolle's family lived at Thornton le Dale, near the town of Pickering, close to the North York moors. Bramley's reference to him in his introduction as, quote, one of the worthies of Yorkshire, makes clear that some of his interest in Rolle and his work was due to their shared geographic roots. As I hope to show, Bramley's sympathy and even identification with Rolle ran deeper than this, however, although it did not prevent the Victorian editor from being objective about the particulars of Rolle's text once he sat down to edit. In this woodcut portrait prefaced to a 16th century edition of Meditations that Wynkyn de Worde, the London printer, erroneously attributed to Rolle, the hermit has in one hand a set of prayer beads and in the other a pike staff for traversing rough ground. Rolle's life as a hermit, it must be said, would be more comfortable than is suggested by this portrait, since it was conducted at times in the households of well-to-do patrons rather than in the wild. Presumably, This circumstance gave Rolle access to libraries, thereby facilitating his development as a writer and especially as a commentator on scripture. As a young man, Rolle studied at Oxford, another important connection with Bramley, an opportunity made possible by the patronage of Thomas de Neville, Archdeacon of Durham. At the age of 19, dissatisfied with secular learning and anxious about the state of his soul, Rolle left university and returned to his father's house. There, he underwent a dramatic spiritual awakening, fashioning two of his sister's skirts and his father's rain hood into a makeshift religious habit and escaping to the woods. In his writings, Rolle promotes the solitary, contemplative life as beneficial to the soul and superior to an active life in the world, citing in support of his argument Old Testament verses from the books of Job, the Psalms, and the prophet Jeremiah, and New Testament descriptions of the career of John the Baptist. We'll come back to him later in connection with one of Bramley's sermons. He also holds the opinion, Rolle does, that ecstatic visionary experience, subjective as it is, forms the very basis of religion, without which an institutional church could not exist, let alone thrive. As we shall see, Bramley, an Anglican priest with a taste for pomp and circumstance, came to be attracted to Rolle's view. Despite a renewed infatuation with Roman Catholicism in 19th century Oxford, this view was becoming more common among intellectuals as a byproduct of interest in the psychology of religion. In Bramley's lifetime, it would be formalized by the American pragmatist philosopher William James in his Gifford Lectures on the Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902. One of the fascinating conclusions of Bramley's work on the English Psalter edition was his view that, despite the recorded facts of Rolle's biography, Rolle wasn't very eccentric at all. Instead, Bramley presents him as a sound teacher of the faithful, reliable, rarely esoteric, and never heterodox. Rolle's early years as a solitary were marked, according to his own account, by what can seem like self-aggrandizing public gestures. Some of these involved the Psalms. In church one day, he sat in the place reserved for the wife of the man who would become his first patron in religion, the Esquire John Dalton. Then, on his own impulse, he put on a surplice, sang psalms and hymns with the clerics, and entered the pulpit to deliver an impromptu sermon that moved the congregation to tears. Unlike Bramley, Rolle was not a priest, nor did he ever seek ordination. Nevertheless, in his edition, Bramley retells without criticism the story of this spontaneous sermon to demonstrate, as he says, Rolle's special charisma as a preacher, information he derives from George Perry's 1866 edition of some of Rolle's prose treatises for the Early English Text Society. Rolle's behavior could be frankly provocative. Bramley notes flatly that, quote, his devotion seems to have been spontaneous and his rule of life unsanctioned by external authority. The neutral tone, I would suggest, is designed to disable both praise and blame. Throughout his religious life, Rolle was overcome by transcendent states that could involve a separation from ordinary reality. For example, according to his disciples, Rolle was able, while ecstatic, to write out treatises and to deliver oral instruction on different topics simultaneously. Bramley, in his edition, qualifies some of these accounts of Rolle's enthusiasm, but never sharply. For instance, of Rolle's report that a woman who tempted him at night was none other than the devil in disguise, Bramley remarks simply, quote, "Nothing in the story may not be explained from ordinary causes." More often, he emphasizes Rolle's moderation. Bramley presents Rolle's views concerning priests set forth throughout the English Psalter as sane and balanced. Quote, "It is said of priests by Rolle that many fail and few are holy. Yet it is also asserted that oftentimes priests open to others by way of the sacraments and moral instruction the pathway to heaven." On the orthodoxy of Rolle's commentary itself, a vexed issue that Perry had raised in his Eats edition of some of Rolle's prose, Bramley is even-handed toward both Rolle and his Wycliffite revisers. Quote, "Rolle is free from the abnormal doctrines and political extravagances which vitiated the teachings of the Lollards, assembling in his commentary a text that appeals to, quote, persons of very different ways of thinking. Some of these persons Bramley specifies variously: 18th and 19th century Dominican scholars, and Dr. Adam Clarke, the famous Methodist theologian, who used the English Psalter in his popular early 19th century commentary on the entire Bible. Clarke, incidentally, once owned a very early Northern manuscript of the English Psalter, the so-called Roseberry Roll, copied circa 1380, and now in the collection of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Bramley makes clear in his introduction that he admires the influence of the Psalms on Rolle's life. As Rolle tells the story, while listening to psalmody in a chapel, he first sensed the three stages of somatic or bodily awareness of divine love that form the most distinctive theme of his life and writings. These are calor, a pleasant inner heat, followed by dulcor, a sweet taste of mysterious origin, and finally canor, anticipation of the song of the angels in heaven. This triad of heat, sweetness, and song describes in Rolle's works, including passages in the English Psalter, the stages of his own development as a contemplative and a path for others to follow. In his prologue, Rolle explains that the fire of love is kindled in the hearts of anyone who says or sings the Psalms devoutly in praise of Jesus Christ. Bramley's own career as a religious involved the Psalms in multiple inspirational ways, preeminently by way of his work on the Rolle edition, but likewise in the intersecting areas of hymnology, liturgy, personal piety, preaching, and spiritual direction that were all a part of Bramley's pastoral life. In this respect, Bramley's career imitated, consciously or not, that of his fellow North countryman, the hermit, Richard Rolle. H.R. Bramley was born on the 4th of June, 1833, at Addingham to a prominent Yorkshire family, and he died at Lincoln on the 28th of January 1917, following long service to Oxford University and the Anglican Church. This slide shows him in both capacities around the age of 25. He looks a little bit like Rolle in the Wincand Award woodcut, although I doubt that the resemblance in personal styling is intentional. Bramley flourished at Oxford, where he first matriculated at Oriel College, transferred on his own initiative after a year to University College, where he took both his BA and MA, and then was admitted to a fellowship at Magdalen College, where he became tutor for all but 3 years between 1858 and 1883. During this time, the winds of change were blowing through Oxford. According to his obituary in the London Times, however, Bramley was, quote, a link with old Oxford. When religious tests were mandatory, non-Anglicans were prohibited from holding fellowships until 1871, and dons had to be celibate. Fellows could not marry until 1877. A lifelong bachelor, Bramley once asserted in his stubborn Yorkshire way that he was in favor of progress, quote, but progress backward. Like many Victorian medievalists, he preferred living in the past. In 1884, the year in which he published his English Psalter edition, he served as vice president of Magdalen. The next year, possibly on the strength of the edition, he became Dean of Divinity for the college and then examining chaplain to the Bishop of Lincoln, in which capacity he was expected to scrutinize candidates for ordination. One of Bramley's most significant posts at Magdalen was as Senior Dean of Arts between 1871 and 1882, in which role he disciplined, among other students, an undergraduate named Oscar Wilde. In a letter of 1875, written from the Hotel St. George in Corfu, Wilde had explained to Bramley that he would, regrettably, miss the first 10 days of his second Michaelmas term because he has followed an old Irish tutor, Mr. Mahaffey, from Italy to Greece. And Mahaffey, being such a clever man, this is Wilde writing, that it is quite as good as going to lectures to be in his society. Attempting to appeal to Bramley's religious sensibilities, which were high church, Wilde describes some of the, quote, magnificent mosaics of Madonnas that he has already seen, adding, however, that he has also learned from reading a book that Bramley lent him how, quote, the Roman Catholics do certainly seem to confuse together Catholic doctrines, which we may all hold, and the supremacy of the Pope, which we need not hold. On Wilde's tardy return to Oxford, Bramley had him fined £47 and rusticated or sent down for a time. Happily, Wilde graduated in 1878 with a double first. Perhaps the final line of Wilde's very beautiful lyric, Magdalen Walks, is a backhanded tribute to Bramley's supervisory acuity in college. Quote, the kingfisher flies like an arrow and wounds the air. Bramley was so influential at Magdalen that many expected him to succeed his close friend, the college president, Frederick Bully, when he died in 1885. At this point, with the Rolle edition out and enjoying at age 51 good health, Bramley loved horseback riding. His star was in the ascendant. Others, however, were opposed and dismissed Bramley as an old dinosaur, a figure of fun. In this cartoon, Bramley appears across from the college tower, digging in St. Clement's churchyard, a 12th century cemetery that once occupied the site of the current roundabout at Magdalen Bridge. Juxtaposed to Bramley's somewhat ghoulish behavior and countenance, which echoes that of the two skulls in the lower right-hand corner of the cartoon, is a short parody of A Christmas Carol. This is a direct hit at Bramley's most successful book. Not the English Psalter edition, I'm afraid, but Christmas Carols New and Old, first published in 1867 and reissued in many expanded editions into the early 20th century. Bramley collaborated on the book with Magdalen's organist and choirmaster, John Stainer. Bramley being responsible for the texts of the carols, some of these edited and translated from medieval originals, and Stainer for the music. The cartoon's carol, with its concluding allusion to Ezekiel 37, verse 3, suggests something morbidly Gothic in Bramley and his medievalism. An ancient carol. Now carol forth your joyous lays, ye happy souls, each Xmas day, and ask, as ye your greetings give, if ever these dry bones shall live. Even in plush aesthetic surroundings, Bramley can appear comical. Here he is in a painting by the great Pre-Raphaelite Holman Hunt, May morning on Magdalen Tower. The tall, bald man on the right with a long gray beard, squeezed between the mustachioed Stainer and John Bloxam, Magdalen's first historian, in red. Bloxam had revived the college tradition of singing the Hymnus Eucharisticus from Magdalen Tower at sunrise on May 1st, the occasion depicted in the painting. While Holman Hunt treats the tradition with reverence, his portrait of Bramley has elements of caricature about it. Of posing for his likeness, Bramley complained to a friend in a letter, quote, "I had to stand for hours on a plank with my mouth wide open." Bramley was seriously religious. He was ordained deacon of the Church of England in 1856 and priest in 1858. From the late 15th century and into the 1950s, Magdalen had appointed the vicar of St. Giles's Church in Horspath, a village 3 miles from Oxford. Bramley served there regularly between 1861 and 1869, and occasionally for many years thereafter, although it was a lifetime appointment with no expectation of prolonged service. He was also a generous benefactor of the church, giving it a stained glass window, a chancel screen, and a treble bell bearing his name and the rhyming inscription, Deus Laudo Dignis Plaudo, an apt slogan for an editor of the Psalms. After leaving Oxford, Bramley lived for the remainder of his life with his widowed sister Anne at Needham Hall, a venerable pile now burned down just north of Lincoln, where Bramley was installed as canon and precentor of Lincoln Cathedral through 1905. For Bramley, like Rolle, theological writing was an important part of being a pastor. Some of his works seem to me immediately relevant to his interest in and editing of Rolle's English Psalter, because they indicate sympathy with its author and perspicacity concerning the interpretation of early texts. Bramley's first major work, published in 1874, the year he embarked on the Rolle edition, is a close translation of Gregory the Great's 6th century manual for bishops, known commonly as the Pastoral Care. Bramley worked from the standard Benedictine text and gives its Latin on facing pages with his translation. He explains, in assigning his book an idiosyncratic title, The Pastoral Charge, that he does so in deference to Gregory himself, who actually entitled his volume Liber Regulae Pastoralis, a book of rules for pastors, not De Cura Pastorali. This fastidiousness about the Latin permeates Bramley's translation. He repeats, for example, in his introduction, the philologist Henry Sweet's assessment of King Alfred's famous West Saxon version of the Pastoral Care as, quote, a paraphrase rather than an accurate translation. The fastidiousness about Latin likewise foreshadows his scrupulousness with Rolle's Latin, the aim of the English Psalter having been, in Rolle's own words, to allow, quote, those who know no Latin by way of the English to learn many Latin words. During his career in Oxford, Bramley also delivered many sermons and saw several of them into print. One is of special note, I think, in connection with his Rolle project. In 1867, on St. John the Baptist's feast day, he preached in Magdalen Chapel on the theme of religious retirement or solitude. The burden of his sermon is that John the Baptist's life in the desert was not an eccentric pursuit, but a necessary prelude to his evangelism. Quote, it was by the stern discipline of solitude, Bramley says, that John was strengthened for his work of preparing the way of the Lord. Far from the din, a hermit of the wilderness, his spirit was hardened to brave the scorn of men, to preach without wavering the coming judgment, to denounce sin in high places without flinching, and to lay down his life rather than retract. Not only was the Baptist's life not eccentric, according to Bramley, it is a model for everyone, since, quote, such intervals of retirement are most necessary for all who would wax strong in spirit. In the routine of business, the whirl of pleasure, the unbroken succession of trifling but continual occupations, the attention is engaged, the energies exhausted, the mind preoccupied. The effort necessary to concentrate the thoughts on invisible realities is never made, or if made, is so soon relaxed as to produce but little practical effect. Bramley opposes here, in words reminiscent of Rolle's, the contemplative and active lives. Moreover, just as Rolle argues in the prologue to the English Psalter that the mystic wisdom of the Psalms should be available to an audience wider than contemplatives, Bramley implies in editing and introducing Rolle's text for a general readership. That's how OUP, incidentally, advertised Bramley's edition, that the eremitic life can and should be lived even while enduring the pressures of society, at the very least, by a disciplined attention to the words and teachings of the Psalms. Bramley also published, during his time at Oxford and afterwards, works of religious meditation and polemic. In 1880, for example, he brought out semi-anonymously, under only his initials, meditations and prayers upon the 7 words of our Lord Jesus Christ from the cross. This Lenten booklet was privately printed by a group called the Sisterhead of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, an Anglo-Catholic sodality based in the Woodstock Road, Oxford, for whom Bramley served as spiritual director. Aside from the obvious parallel between Bramley's supervision of the sodality and Rolle's direction of a group of nuns, including Margaret Kirkby, for whom he composed the English Psalter, the meditations are significant for their heavy reliance on the Psalms and what might be called their daring ecumenical character. In the introduction to his English Psalter edition, Bramley praises the Christological emphasis of Rolle's exegesis. Quote, in his comments, he sees Christ throughout. It's unclear whether Bramley knows that much of this emphasis derives from Peter Lombard, since he doesn't trace in his edition Rolle's sources. Bramley knew, however, that reading the Psalms as typological prophecies of Christ was standard. And that's how he presents them too in his meditations, sometimes incorporating, in paraphrase, some of Rolle's expositions. Also, he boldly interweaves Rolle's insights concerning the Psalms of the Passion with those of a 17th century Jesuit, Alonso Messia Bedoya, who published his own devotions of the 3 hours of the agony of Christ in response to the devastations of a Peruvian earthquake in 1687. Like the English Psalter, in other words, Bramley's meditations may be recommended to, quote, persons of very different ways of thinking. Among Bramley's polemical writings, 2 are indirectly relevant to his English Psalter project. Pamphlets that he published in 1879 and 1897, the second, after he left Oxford, concerning controversies over the Greek phrase tuto poete, this do, that is, in remembrance of me, in New Testament accounts of Jesus's Last Supper. The particulars of Bramley's views concerning the Eucharist are less important than what he describes to his modernist opponents as a common sense method for arguing about the meanings of words in ancient texts. His principle of interpreting New Testament Greek is as follows, and I quote, the same words in the same context, that is, either recurring in one and the same passage or repeated in the same connection in several passages, are, as a rule, to be taken in the same sense. This is exactly the principle that Bramley applies in emending Rolle's text when conflicting variants present themselves in different manuscripts of the English Psalter. And it's the practice he used in assembling the glossarial index to his edition, for which the formidable Middle English editor Walter Skeat wrote a long headnote on Northern dialect. In the glossary entries, Bramley regularly gives Latin etymons and, where appropriate, Icelandic, Anglo-Saxon, and Old French ones. Also, he avoids giving a connotative range of meanings, preferring instead to stick with the denotative sense of words. He cites parallel uses of words in contemporaneous Middle English texts, Chaucer's works, presumably because of his unique authority as a Middle English writer, and the Prick of Conscience, presumably because Bramley, like others at the time, assigned its authorship to Richard Rolle. This plain, even involuted method of glossing follows the same principle Bramley brought to resolving New Testament Greek conundra. The editor trusts the language of the text to explain the text, separate from subtle questions or concerns that might arise from the themes and ideas developed in this or that passage. In the last part of my talk, I'd like to discuss briefly Bramley's approach to his base manuscript for the English Psalter edition, Oxford University College, MS 64. In the slide, you see two disparate folios from the manuscript set side by side. On the left, folio 18 verso, with, in the middle of the first column, the incipit to the first Salvum me fac psalm, number 11 in the Vulgate, and on the right, folio 71 recto, with at the bottom of the first column, the incipit to the second Salvum me fac psalm, number 68 in the Vulgate. Psalm 68 is the one illustrated in my title slide with the story of Jonah. The leaves in this slide depict an important and standard feature of manuscripts of the English Psalter, the use of a hierarchy of scripts, and sometimes rubrication to distinguish on the page the Latin psalm versus their Middle English translations and the running Middle English commentary. The program is clearer if we look at the left-hand side of the slide in detail, as you can see here. First, the Vulgate Latin. Qui dixerunt linguam nostram magnificabimus, labia nostra a nobis sunt, quis noster dominus est. The Latin in larger textura, letter forms, sometimes with looped Anglicana ascenders. Beneath that, the wilcus et ora tunga, we sal worship, ora lippas ovos, qua is ora Lord, in modern English, who have said, we will magnify our tongue, our lips are our own, who is Lord over us. The verbatim Middle English translation in Anglicana and secretary mix, the translation signaled by the rubricators touching the initial letter thorn in red. And third, the Hippocrates, etc., the hypocrites, the running commentary introduced with a red paraph marker and red underlining of some of the initial letter forms. In more elaborate copies of the English Psalter, such as the Rosebery Rolle, which you see here, this program is more consistent and decorative than it is in Unif 64. Latin verse in large textura letters, written every other line, Middle English translation entirely underlined in red and sequestered from the Latin and running commentary with red bracketing, and the running commentary in a smaller textura script. This format in the Rosebery Psalter imitates consciously the layout and design of Latin biblical commentary manuscripts. In comparison with the Rosebery Rolle, Unif 64 and its formatting are unprepossessing and inconsistent. Bramley, in his edition, stabilizes the reader's engagement with the three levels of Rolle's text by consistently giving his Latin in boldface and segregating Rolle's translations and commentaries from the Latin text and from each other with pilcrows or paraph signs. He also regularizes the erratic punctuation of Unif 64 by introducing many more commas, although he retains, curiously, the punctus elevatus, rather than translating it into a semicolon. There is a small but important archival file on Bramley's edition preserved at the Oxford University Press. According to the archivist who is sending these materials to me as we talk, this file records Bramley's involvement with the formatting of his text, an important editorial intervention that renders Rolle's discourse more coherent for a 19th century reader. Additionally, as you can see on this slide, Unif 64 suffered significant textual losses, some of them made up by a later early 16th century hand. Anne Hudson has detailed these in an important appendix to the first volume of her Eates edition of the Wycliffite revisions to Rolle. They occur across the manuscript's quires, and some of their complexity eluded Bramley, as it still does modern scholars, none of whom, to my knowledge, have fully collated the surviving manuscripts of Rolle's original text, a process that might resolve codicological questions about Unif 64 itself. For instance, is the text that you see here on the right, provided by the early 16th century hand, derived from those leaves lost from this codex, or from some other manuscript or group of copies? If the former, why did those leaves from Unif 64 go missing? And where are they now, if not destroyed? If the latter, what relationship, if any, pertains between the multiple copies used by the 16th century scribe who made up the losses? And was this scribe a man by the name of William Ray, who indexed the Psalms on a flyleaf in Unif 64, or, as Anne Hudson suggests, someone else? When Bramley encountered Unif 64, he must have been puzzled and intrigued by its challenges. Maybe he first saw the book as an undergraduate. It was in Unif's library since the 17th century. Its language indicates that its scribe was a Yorkshireman, probably from the West Riding. A homesick undergraduate with a strong spiritual bent might have taken solace from spending a few hours with such a book, a tangible link to the North that reinforced, by way of its commentary, his devout sensibility. Or Bramley might have sought out the manuscript sometime around 1866 or 1867 after reading Perry's Eates edition of Rolle's prose, a text he refers to in the introduction to his English Psalter edition. Perry writes in his preface that, quote, one of the chief objects which it is hoped will be served by this publication is the leading to further transcripts of genuine English works of Rolle's, which may be found in our great libraries, and few of which have as yet been printed. Perry's preface also includes a transcript of Rolle's Latin office that concludes with the following query, quote, an attempt is now being made by the Committee of the Early English Text Society to obtain a perfect list of the English writings of Richard Rolle, with beginnings and endings. Any information or assistance in this matter will be thankfully received by the editor of this work. I do not know if Bramley responded to Perry's entreaties, but it is easy enough to see how such a query might have provoked his deeper interest in Rolle's writings. When one reads Perry's overwrought descriptions of Rolle's, quote, wildest extravagances of mysticism, and of Rolle's style as, quote, terse and nervous, and contrasts these with Bramley's depiction of Rolle's life and writings as restrained and accessible, it seems plausible that Bramley shaped his view of Rolle and his texts as a deliberate corrective to Parry's. One element in Parry's account that certainly stimulated Bramley was his pattern of references to Bodley's MS Laud Miss 286, a conflate copy of the English Psalter that presents through Psalm 17 a Wycliffite revision of Rolle, and thereafter Rolle's original text. The manuscript opens with a metrical preface distinguishing Rolle's efforts from those of his evil Lollard interpolators, who have grafted heresy onto otherwise orthodox exegetical work. Printing the metrical preface at the head of his edition was a bold gesture by Bramley, a full disclosure style declaration concerning the complex circulation and adaptation of Rolle's work. Bramley read the text of the preface, which survives only in this manuscript, critically, providing toward its end a conjectural emendation for a didograph that demonstrates his acumen as a textual editor. Bramley understood Unif 64's importance as a key surviving witness to Rolle's original commentary. He knew 14 manuscripts of Rolle's English Psalter, but like an insightful modern editor, chose this problematic one, and relatively late one, as his base, because he reckoned its language to be closest to that of the text's author. He did not, as someone preparing a full critical edition would, collate all the copies he knew. He does, however, print parallel extracts from 12 of these to demonstrate similarities and differences between their language. He knew the importance of systematic collation to resolving questions of authorship and authorial intention. In a letter preserved in the Magdalen College archives, he writes to a scholar who is asking about the college's copy of part of the Imitatio Christi, critiquing, in his letter, H.O. Cox's catalog entry on the manuscript and offering to check it against others. Bramley notes in the introduction to his English Psalter edition that another promising northern copy of the text, which he would have liked to have used more extensively, Newcastle Public Library, 1678, came to his attention too late. Like Unif 64, however, Newcastle has significant losses. His duties kept him largely in Oxford during his project, although he did make trips to Cambridge to consult Sidney Sussex College's early copy of Rolle's text, because he uses that as the base for the Latin in his edition. Bramley's edition, which has, as I've suggested, its limitations, is not simply a diplomatic transcript of what he found in 2 or 3 manuscripts. It is a much more intelligent production than the, quote, further transcripts of genuine English works of Rolle's that Parry called for in his Eates edition of some of the English prose. Spot checking of the edition against Unif 64 and the Sidney Sussex manuscript reveal remarkably few errors. Most of these are in the Latin and involve, I suspect, confusion of minims by the OUP typesetters in what would have been Bramley's handwritten fair copy. This document, however, does not survive. In 143 cases, Bramley provides readings from Sidney Sussex that are omitted in Unif. All of these are registered at the foot of the page. He also frequently records interesting variants between the 2 manuscripts and doublets that occur in Sydney, Sussex, but not in Unif. For example, in Psalm 34, Utica Domine at verse 6, 2 words for temptation, edging from Old Norse, or enticing from Old French. His contributions to clarifying Rolle's language and distinctive idiom would repay further minute philological study. Although he does not annotate his text, he sometimes gives, at the bottom of the page, short glosses that occur in the manuscripts he has consulted. In one case, concerning a reference to false prophets in Rolle's commentary on Psalm 10 in Domino Confido, a marginal annotation, hereticos sudi prophetas et lollardos. To conclude, Henry Ramsden Bramley found in Richard Rolle a kindred spirit, a fellow Yorkshireman possessed of a religious fervor rooted in the Psalms, who identified not only preaching but theological writing as an essential part of his pastoral vocation. Against the prevailing view of Rolle's spirituality as idiosyncratic, Bramley advanced the idea that his hero was sane and wrote deliberately for a wide rather than narrow audience, pious Christians living both contemplative and active lives. While there is surely some special pleading in his arguments and an element of what a psychologist might call projection, a subconscious desire to see himself in his subject, Bramley managed by his research and considerable textual skills to rescue Rolle from casual treatment by scholars as a medieval crank, and from the obscurity the English Psalter would still be enduring had Bramley never sat down to wrestle with its text in its imperfect, complicated manuscript witnesses. For these reasons, H.R. Bramley deserves to be better known and even lauded as an eminent Victorian editor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarkable presentation and an insightful lecture, for bringing to our attention the intricacies of Rolle's and Bramley's life and work. It's fascinating to learn how each of these men struggled with the substance of language, each in his own way. Bramley, as he rescued the translation of his predecessor from the 14th century, and Rolle, as he translated the Psalms into his vernacular. Thank you for showing us how they mediated the meaning of the Psalms via the translational and editorial endeavors, and also for showing us how we have to remember about all these different layers that we have access today in our modern world via all these translations and medieval manuscripts and editions and re-editions and all the work, philological work and philological endeavor behind it. So I think that on behalf of everyone here, I can express my thanks to you for your lovely talk. Thank you so much. When we were planning this seminar, Magda and I thought that it would be a good idea to give plenty of time, not just to the speaker, although first of all to him, but also to our audience for a general discussion, for specific questions, so that we can all share our ideas and learn as much as possible from the speaker and from one another. So we'd like all of you to join the discussion. Just to let you know a few practical things before we started. You can do it in two ways. Either you can raise your hand by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen, and then you can ask your question in person orally, or you can alternatively type your question into the chat if you cannot use your microphone, for example, and then I'll read it aloud. So without much further ado, it's time for questions and discussion now.
So Monica, will you identify people when they raise their hands and call on them for me? Because I can't see everyone on my screen.
I will, yes, yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
Can't see any questions on chat yet, and I can't see any raised hands. Oh, yes, Jane.
Hi.
Hi, Jane.
Oh, there I am. Sorry. Looking for myself and suddenly I'm bigger. So I'm having trouble deciding what to ask about because I didn't connect this Bramley with the carols and that I've known my whole life. So I found fascinating. But on the other hand, that's not really the Psalms. So I'll just sort of leave that and think I was really interested in the fact that as you elucidated so brilliantly here, that it's Bramley who rescued Rolle from being perceived as a crank. And I guess I was just kind of, is there anything more to that you would like to say? Because it just seemed to me that he wanted to make Rolle into a kind of Anglican.
Yeah. I mean, I think, he, like any scholar, I mean, when I remember when during the 17 years that I was editing the glossed Wycliffite Psalter, I felt over that long period of time as if, I were actually able to imagine, certain things about the thinking and even feeling, if not the identity of the anonymous person who put that book together. I think if scholarship doesn't have a component like that, then it's pretty, arid. And, we're trying to establish a connection with the past and therefore, are always trying to work through the intentions of these often, since we're medievalists, shadowy figures who produced these texts. As I imply pretty strongly in my paper, Bramley himself, was, I think, kind of written off as a kind of crank, outside of his inner circle in Oxford, somebody who had been left behind by New Oxford. Another one of his polemical writings has to do with the decision of the university to abandon religious tests for the granting of fellowships. He wrote expansively, 70, I call it a pamphlet, it's 70 pages long, really vigorously arguing that these tests, religious examinations, should remain in place. So there's no doubt in my mind that he identified deeply with Rolle, but in identifying with him, of course, transferred to Rolle some of his own personal characteristics, his Anglicanism, which in practice was very high church, but ideologically, as it were, as I tried to suggest in talking about his relationship with that sodality in Oxford and the use of that Peruvian Jesuits meditations in his Lenten booklet, there was a part of Bramley that was generously inclusive in terms of his religious views, if not ecumenical, and he sees this as really one of the most distinctive features of Rolle, as he understands him, that a work like the English Psalter is written in such a way that it can appeal to the widest possible audience, not not just this small group of devotees, but, people of active life, worldly responsibility, people of different religious persuasions, as he indicates. Mm. And that's pretty astounding. I mean, it's, it indicates, a complexity in the editor's own psychology, which, probably well served rather than ill served his, nuts and bolts work on the edition.
Yeah. Did it sell well?
I think it, I'm waiting for this archive to, it's not a very substantial archive, 12 letters, publication announcement. It was marketed to a general audience, it's published by the Clarendon Press.
Yeah.
It wasn't an Eats volume. So, I really don't know. I mean, there's not, the file is not very thick on it at OUP, but I'll see what it has to say when the Xeroxes arrive. Yeah. But I think, I'm pretty sure, and I'm looking into the correspondence of, people who, knew Bramley as a friend, in college and outside. I'm pretty sure that it was on the basis of the Rolle edition that he was named Dean of Divinity in his college.
Sort of the vindication that he needed.
Yeah, that's a pretty cruel caricature of him, digging up St. Clement's churchyard.
Yeah, that must have been hard to take. Anyway, I should leave space for others. So thank you.
Thank you for your question.
That was excellent.
Thank you, Jane. So we can now move on to other questions. So if you could please raise your hand so that I can spot you. And right, we have a question on chat from Elizabeth Solopova. So I will read it aloud. It's just a request for, so let me see where you are. All right, here.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you very much.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. And thank you very much for a fascinating talk that I really enjoyed. I knew very little about Bramley. Next to nothing. But my question is, do you have a sense whether Bramley's choice of the base text was a good one? And you probably know that in the 60s and 70s, work on re-editing Bramley was undertaken at Fordham University, and several doctoral theses were produced editing parts of the Psalter, and they used the same manuscripts. And Hudson also says in her edition that Bramley's edition and Bramley's choice of the base text is a reasonable basis for her purposes, for her comparison with the revised Psalter. But do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I do think that it was a sound decision, and I'm teaching graduate bibliography and methods right now, and we're talking about how one might choose a base for an edition. Here you have a late manuscript, late in two ways. It's 15th and 16th century in terms of its contents, so it's not close in time to the author, but the language itself is remarkably close. I mean, I think Skeet, demonstrates this pretty. Skeet was someone who, he was a real workhorse, but he didn't have a lot of time for ideas that he felt, really had nothing in them. I mean, he would pass over them, very quickly, and he wrote this really substantial introduction to the dialect, which is prefaced to the glossary. So I think Skeet, felt that, given the limited number of witnesses known at the time, that this was a good choice. another reason I'm convinced that it was a sound choice on Bramley's part is that it would have had to have been a careful and deeply resolved choice for him to overcome the most obvious impediment of using Unif 64, which was that, large chunks of it are copied in the 16th century in what he himself identified as a slightly different dialect. I mean, there are Scots features to the dialect of the 16th century parts of the manuscript, which a modern critical editor would probably adjust to bring them. I mean, they're not extravagant in terms of their character, but I can't come up with any examples right off the top of my head, but they're the spelling of the word lord, laird. A modern editor would adjust those to bring them more in line with the rest of the text, perhaps signaling that in the introduction. Bramley lets those stand, so he knew that it was problematic to use those parts of his base, but he went ahead and used the base anyhow. And I don't think it was simply because of matters of convenience or piety associated with his having been a student at UNIF. I think it was a sound decision, but the only way anything definitive can be said about the edition is for it to be completely collated against the manuscript. One thing he doesn't register in the edition is cancellations. And he must have noticed them because I've done spot checking of his edition, whole pages of it against the manuscript. And it is amazing how accurate his edition is, but he passes over some interesting cancellations that would be illuminative about readings. He just passes over those. He's the emendation he makes to the metrical preface that he prints from Laud Misk is a conjectural emendation because there is no other copy of the metrical preface, and he reads in place of IEUS or IEUES, Jews, which is a didograph in the line. He reconstructs the original reading as heavinessa. I mean, I think he had a kind of acumen as a critical editor, which is not always on display in the edition itself. But to go back to your original question, I think that was a sound choice on his part, using that. Now, it wouldn't be a sound choice today necessarily, but at the time, yes. Yeah. I see the Roseberry Rolle has been completely digitized now by the Museum of the Bible.
Thank you very much. What you said about rather dismissive attitudes to Bramley as a scholar, I think applies to the edition. And I always had the sense that this is not quite fair. And I think the glossary is good as well and avoids many possible errors and misinterpretations, and is really useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, much more could be said about the glossary based on his whole approach to decoding ancient languages. He really, what's amazing to me is how he could be so immersed subconsciously with the personality of this writer and at the same time objective consistently objective in doing the work of editing. That's the mark of a great scholar, and that's why he deserves to be better known, I think, as a scholar. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm looking for. Yes, Jane Toswell says that she.
Goodbye, Jane.
She has to go to another meeting. Thank you, Jane, for being with us.
Goodbye.
Right. I hope to see you.
See you soon in Oxford.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to teach too. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I'm trying to raise my hand, but maybe I could just ask a question without.
Please do. Please do.
Yes, I see you, Kinga. I see you, Magda.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Well, this was fascinating, and it sent my mind into so many different directions, and I have comments and questions and all sorts of things, but I fished out two things that I want to say. First of all, those parallels that you drew between the two men, they are fascinating. Mm. Obviously, it makes me think how you are related to Bramley and how we all are related to David.
Yes.
King David, I mean.
Yes.
So that's one thing. Another thing is that I think it has been briefly mentioned that both men have been unduly criticized for what they did. They have not been properly appreciated. So what you did for Bramley here is a very important thing, really. And then that takes me on to my original comment or inspiration that your talk gave to me. We all start with the Psalms. Yes. And we start examining them, and they send us into journeys we never envisaged we would be joining. And what is the most, because ultimately you started with the Psalms and you ended with Bramley and his correspondence, and you're digging into things that you're probably going to find out, well, there were the carols and so many other things. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered? Well, I wouldn't like to say by chance, because it's not chance, but also it is, in a way, if you know what I mean. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but there's no clarity when it comes to the Psalms. There's emotions.
No, well, I want to make a comment about the first half of your comment, then I'll answer your question. One of the things that you imply in the first half of your comment, which I think is so true, is that engaging the Psalter encourages empathy. That is the kind of, I spend so much time with the Psalms, and I think of their language as being both ancient and, as I said at the start, uncannily modern. We are all, when we're engaging the Psalter, other Davids, to use the phrase that was frequently circulated in Psalm commentaries. But if we're all other Davids, then we're all, as students of the Psalms, interrelated. That is, there is a kind of, the Psalms encourage a process of imitation that encourages in turn a human habit of empathy, which more people would do well to cultivate. So I think that's a very striking observation that you make. In investigating Bramley's life, the area that I was most surprised by was, and I'm looking into this further, was his involvement with this sodality, this community of Anglo-Catholic nuns in Oxford, who they had their convent out the Woodstock Road, and their mission, really, in addition to living in community and praying, their mission was a social justice one. And Bramley was their spiritual director. He Letters survive from the woman, I forget her name. I leapt over it, and the Mother Superior. Letters survive in the Lincolnshire archives, which I've also ordered. Between them, her thanking him for conducting a Lenten retreat centered around the Psalms. These are uncanny parallels with Richard Rolle's relationship with the small group of women who sought out his spiritual direction. And Bramley, when he died, his I've gotten a copy of his will. His net worth at the time of his death was 33,000 sterling. And at the rate of inflation, that's between 2 and 3 million sterling today. He must have lived, he came from a prominent Yorkshire family, but he must have lived an incredibly frugal life. He rolled most of that money back into the college, but he's just such a fascinating, like somebody out of Lytton Strachey's book Eminent Victorians, which I was alluding to at the very end of my paper. Just a very complex character, but this relationship with the convent of nuns, he was one of 3 priests present at the funeral of the Mother Superior, and one of 3 people to whom she left a meager sum of money. That's interesting to me. Yeah.
All right, Magda, you have raised your hand. Does that mean that
this
you want
time I'm successful because I wanted to say something more, if I'm allowed to.
Yes,
you are. I think that it's no longer necessary for anyone to raise their hands because everyone is on one.
Now that I've learned it,
I can see everyone now. Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay, so psalters are very often ostensibly translated for women, and they are very often used by a much wider audience, something that you emphasized several times.
Yeah.
There is this, Rolle's Psalter is one of them, and there's a parallel Psalter translated into Polish by Walenty Wróbel, also ostensibly for women.
Really?
Also having a very similar structure with the Latin, in the manuscript, Latin incipits, and in the printed version, because this was the early 16th century, with the whole Latin, and then comes the translation, and then comes the exposition. So, in fact, it parallels Rolle's endeavor, and both are ostensibly for women, but both were owned by men, prominent men, and Walenty Wróbel's Psalter was printed so many times that its purchasing power could not have been estimated based on it could not have been intended only for women. There were 2 printings within 2 weeks. This was absolutely unheard of. Why do you think? Why do you think they needed women as excuses, or were they muses or excuses for Psalter translators?
Or excuses. I don't know. The Psalms, they speak to a part of the human soul, which is afflicted, that is, subject to tribulation. And, I don't need to tell any of the women, on the call that, throughout human history, women have been subjected to considerably more tribulation than men. So, there might be, something just essential about, the great prayer of the psalmist is, Lord, save me, Lord, help me in my affliction. that kind of emotional simplicity and directness, I think, would have appealed, to a female audience. Also, women, because of their sufferings throughout history, have proven themselves to be more capable of empathy than most men. So, insofar as the Psalms encourage feelings of empathy, it seems to me, almost natural that they would. I mean, I'm not, I hope that no one's taking these remarks as sexist in one direction or another, but I do think that, it's a fact that that many medieval psalters were copied out and owned and heavily used by women. And I think there's a book to be written on that theme that would be a cross-cultural investigation.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about that, but I also thought that it was somehow assumed men would understand the Latin Psalter and women would not, whereas actually both sexes needed that support. Thank you very much for your answer and for the thoughts.
I mean, as you know from your own work, the male typesetters at OUP, when they set Bramley's edition, did not always understand the Latin, because in your book, many of the errors that you very usefully index in the Latin, I believe, are typesetters errors that were introduced into misreading minims that were introduced into Bramley's edition. I mean, he should have caught them when he was proofreading, but they were introduced there by typesetters who misread the fair copy that he wrote out for them. I'm sure of that.
All right. Can we remain with the edition for a moment? And may I ask a question?
Yes. Uh-huh.
It always fascinates me how, you can learn so much about the idea of the editor, not just by looking at the archival work, the letters, studying his life, etc., which is all very fascinating, and I indulge in it myself as well with great pleasure always. But by studying the edition and by comparing it to the manuscript or the witnesses that the editor used, and sometimes you come across so many striking examples of where you have this divergence, which is facts from the manuscript which are only very hinted at by the editor in his editorial comments and notes, which is especially true of early editions like 19th century editions or early 20th century editions. So you talked about how Bramley selectively treated some of the things that he found in the manuscripts, and you talked about certain omissions. So could you a little bit elaborate on this? Have you found anything? Can you see the purpose behind this and a overarching idea?
Yeah. So the major editorial intervention, the most significant editorial intervention that he made was deciding on a different base for the Latin text, thereby, turning his text, in effect, into a conflate text. So, he didn't, or so he says. I mean, this is a very complicated matter, and there would be a very interesting seminar paper, for instance, for a student in just collating the Latin of Bramley's edition against UNIF 64 to see how many times it diverges from his primary base. But he took the Sidney Sussex manuscript. He explains in his introduction, he took the Sidney Sussex manuscript as the base for the Latin, but he doesn't really say whether he's importing the Latin readings from Sidney Sussex wholesale or whether he's doing so selectively. So that's a gray area in his editorial practice that would, reveal a lot if it were made, blacker rather than left to be gray. The reason he did that, he had a good reason for doing that, choosing a different base for the Latin, because when you read through the 16th century leaves in UNIF 64 that provide for the losses from the original manuscript, the person who wrote those made a lot of errors in transcribing the Latin from whatever manuscript or manuscripts he was using. And there are a lot of cancellations, deletions. And I think that when Bramley saw all of that happening, he decided strategically, and I think this was probably a good decision, to find another base for all the Latin. So I wouldn't be surprised, although I don't know for a fact, if he didn't import all of the Latin from Sidney Sussex, but I don't know. He might have, cosmetically corrected the Latin in UNIF from Sidney Sussex, or, occasionally corrected it. Another thing he does with the Latin is that he modernizes it. I mean, medieval Latin is not classical Latin in terms of the way in which it appears on the page. So, for instance, sometimes in a medieval Latin text, the conjunction said is spelt set with a T rather than a D. Bramley corrects all that. He modernizes it. And he says that he does that in his introduction. So he alerts the reader to the fact that he does that. He doesn't signal, those emendations, with square brackets in the edition, but he does announce them in the introduction. So what does that mean, or what inferences might, one draw from the way he edits Rolle's Latin? Well, he sees, as Rolle sees, the Latin as the primary focus of the vernacular translation and commentary. He sees the vernacular translation, which is very difficult to read. I mean, it's, it makes reading the early version of the Wycliffite Bible seem relaxing. He sees the vernacular translations the way Rolle sees them, as a way of learning many Latin words. And he sees the commentary as a way of turning his audience's attention back to the priority of the Latin, whether they can read the Latin or not. So he wants, it's almost as if the Latin has for him, as it had for Rolle, I think, a kind of iconic character, a kind of, not just semantic value as text on the page, but almost a kind of symbolic value. I mean, that, in terms of his, which variants he chooses to record, because I haven't gone through, I haven't collated the entire edition against UNIF 64, I'd be uncomfortable generalizing about that. But he does seem to be selective. Something catches his attention, like that gloss that I ended with against pseudo prophets and lollards, and he decides to print that. he's kind of a magpie in that way. But there's so much more work to be done, and work that ought to be done on his technique, because it's really, as I said in response to Elizabeth's question, it's astoundingly good. And I don't, people, scholars, they use his edition all the time, but they treat it as if it's, a diplomatic transcript of a problematic manuscript, which it is not.
Yeah, I suppose you can say that the same about many other early editions. They are so scrupulous, right? So diligent. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, some 19th century editions of medieval texts are genuinely bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Other 19th century editions of medieval texts, like Bramley's,
Mm-hmm.
are genuinely good, but they have limitations that are the result of, whatever complex
Mm-hmm.
textual circumstances, etc., the editor was dealing with.
And
Yeah.
sometimes the editorial conventions abiding at the time.
Yes,
Mhm.
correct. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that Hildegund has raised her hand, so over to you.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I guess, thank you very much. This is absolutely not my field of research, but I was a little bit astonished about, and that sort of opened a whole set of astonished questions for me. I was a little bit astonished about that last part about the Latin, because, this is the Latin Gallicanum that had been edited, I don't know how many times over at that time already, and there was scholarly attempts at recovering the text of the Gallicanum or the Gallicanum, the Jerome Psalters already. So why would anybody choose in the 19th century to recover the Latin text of the Gallicanum from one single and apparently slightly arbitrary manuscript? And that sort of opens the second question that I'm wondering here. How much is there a connection in thinking about editing? I mean, this is the time when every classicist starts thinking about how you do critical editions, when people start developing the methodology on that. And apparently what we are encountering here is a different way of thinking. So do we know if there are any interactions? So was Bramley or were his contemporaries in editing English stuff aware of what was going on in the broad field of Latin and Greek editing?
Yeah, Bramley was, if you read his theological writings, he was a consummate Latin scholar, and he was an even more consummate, if that's something one can say, scholar of Greek. He dove into these Eucharistic debates, about the meaning of, a single phrase in Greek, which means, do this in English. He dove into these, and I mean, it's fascinating to me. I'm not a adept at Greek, but I mean, these are fascinating texts to me, because what they reveal, as I said in the paper, is his editorial acumen. And I think one of the fascinating things about Bramley, when my dissertation director was a man by the name of George Kane, who was general editor of the Athlone Press Piers Plowman series. And he gave a paper at the beginning of his career in Oxford on conjectural emendation in Middle English editing. That is, providing readings in square brackets that are not attested by any of the surviving manuscript or early print witnesses. And he says somewhere in that paper that it took so many hundreds of years for principles to be established, textual critical principles to be established for the editing of the Bible. Mm-hmm. That is, of the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin texts of scriptures. And he remarks, following that remark, that seen in this connection, our work as editors of Middle English texts has only just begun. You know, he assumes, you see, that it's going to take perhaps several hundred years more for the theory and practice of editing Middle English texts to become clarified. Now, I don't know that I agree with that view, but I will say that there are not many scholars who think about the principles of editing Middle English texts as being in the same kind of hopper or category of seriousness that applies to editing, you know, the sacred texts of the Old and New Testament, except for at the end of the 14th century, the anonymous scholars who produced the Wycliffite translations, and in the 19th century, Henry Bramley, because he brings to his editing of Richard Rolle, you know, who was dismissed by most people of the time as a kind of crank, you know, his works of interest for primarily dialect reasons. That's why Perry, you know, was interested in them. Bramley thinks, I believe, that the same scrupulousness should be brought to editing the English Psalter that should be brought to understanding the Greek words and phrases of the New Testament. That's an amazing position for his day. There was a much more casual attitude toward the state of Middle English texts and Middle English editing than there was toward Latin and Greek and Hebrew editing. And Bramley is in the non-casual category. I mean, I think he's trying to be as serious, you know, about Rolle's text as he would be about, you know, that passage from the Gospel of Luke, where the Last Supper takes place. He brings the same level of scrutiny to Rolle. Now, in terms of, you know, the Gallicanum, well, you know, that was the base for the Wycliffite translation of two translations of the Psalms, and Forshall and Madden had brought out their monumental edition in 1850. So I haven't, you know, found in the Bramley archive any response to Forshall and Madden's edition of the Wycliffite Bible. I will say that one thing that Bramley tries to do is to drive a wedge between Rolle and the Wycliffites. He seeks to separate their interests and concerns in a way that not everyone was doing in the 19th century.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been 2 hours now, so unless there are any other questions, I think that brings us to a good place to finish our meeting today, unless I hear any objections from you. So
thank you so much to everyone for setting things up and inviting me to speak. It was great. It's rare that you get the chance to try out sort of new material on people, and it was so nice to have these questions and this is a wonderful series. I can't wait for the rest of the papers.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us, and for being our first inaugural speaker in this series. So thank you again for this wonderful talk. Thanks to the audience on behalf of the organizers, Magdalena and myself. And let me take this opportunity also to invite all of you to our next lecture, which will take place on February the 23rd, as you can see on the slide. Our next speaker is Samira Lindstedt from the University of Oxford, who will be talking about the practice and symbolism in an unpublished 15th century Psalmic prayer. I hope we'll see you there. And we cordially invite everyone to the next lecture in February. Thank you so much for your presence today.
Thank you, Monica and Magda. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
I think we have food for thought for 1 month.
See you.
See you. Thank you.
Magda and Monica, since I am the host, I'm just staying on until everybody's gone.
Yes. Magda, I think you can stop the sharing the screen right now.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that went very well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that was splendid. Just amazing.
2 hours, 2.5 for us.
Yes, and it is usually 20 minutes during a conference meeting and a 10-minute discussion, whereas you just sometimes just need time to think about the questions because you're ruminating what has been said. So thank you for all your help. Gundi, thank you for your yesterday morning 6 o'clock wake-up call to do this, to run the test, and for being here earlier today.
My pleasure. I actually have a meeting at 2, so
yes.
I should be
so just switch us off.
Okay.
So
switch us off.
if you want to go on talking to each other, then I'll just make one of the 2 of you hosts.
Okay.
No, I think we're good. I think we're good.
Very good.
Unless Monica, you want to talk?
No, I wanted to say just a quick word about the recording. If you could, share it with us, not to, publicize it in any way, but just to listen to it all.
Of course, I talked to Grant. I mean, I don't know how works, but
thank you.
It's somewhere. Yeah, thank you. And
thank you.
Are we going to keep this half hour before?
I think we might.
Yeah.
Let's do it again next time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Excellent. Very good.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.